Hi guys, my name is Stavros. I'm the author of the Tome of 6, Book 1 of the Fateful Force, and I'm also a Warbow Archer and experimental archaeologist. And today we have a very, very special test. So let's hit it. Oof.
By the mid-16th century, handheld firearms had supplanted the bow and arrow as the premier ranged weapon across much of the globe. Yet despite this shift, archery persisted in many regions, the bow remaining a formidable instrument of war, continuing to see effective use well into the 17th century alongside firearms, particularly across the Asian continent. One major power that continued to employ the traditional bow alongside firearms was the Mughal Empire. In today's test, we aim to explore the reasoning behind this strategic choice in weaponry. While many factors can influence the adoption of a weapon system in a combat environment, one of the most critical in evaluating its consideration is its ability to deliver efficient and lethal force against contemporary armor. This key factor will form the foundation of our examination. To that end, we will be testing Mughal Empire arrows against Mughal Empire armor, using historical artifacts, not modern reproductions. But we want to reassure the audience, whatever damage we do to the armor will be restored after the test. The Mughal Empire, founded in 1526, was a powerful Islamic dynasty that ruled most of the Indian subcontinent for over 300 years. At its peak, it was known for its military strength, cultural achievements, and administrative sophistication. By the late 17th century, the empire was determined to bring the entire southern region of India under its control. The Adoni fortress was a strategic stronghold controlled by the Bijapur Sultanate, a regional power resisting Mughal authority. This armoured shirt was likely part of a large group of similar pieces captured by Anup Singh, the Maharaja of Bikaner, after the siege of the Adoni fortress in 1689. The authenticity of Bikaner Armoury artifacts is supported by either the presence of unique Bikaner Armoury markings or inscriptions that name the Maharaja and date the entry of the armour into the Bikaner inventory. This particular armour is what we refer to as plate mail or plated mail. However, in the language of the Mughal Empire, it is called Zirah Baktar. This suit of armour was likely that of a heavy cavalryman of the period and intended to be worn over an akitan or some type of padded garment. On the front, plate armour protects the abdomen and lower chest, while the rest is covered in mail. However, the mail links across the armour vary in thickness and robustness depending on their position. The thickest links are placed to protect the most vital areas of the soldier, where plate does not exist. As we move toward the extremities, the mail becomes progressively thinner and lighter, a design compromise that balances protection with mobility, particularly in regions where vital organs are less at risk. What makes this armour particularly intriguing is that it exemplifies a design where mail forms the primary defence. As mentioned previously, the mail armour we will be testing today is thickest around the upper torso. It is constructed from two distinct types of mail rings, arranged in alternating rows. One row consists of thick, robust rings with a relatively large inner diameter. The alternating row features thinner rings with a much smaller inner diameter. The more robust rings measure between 1.26 and 2.34 millimeters in thickness, with an inner diameter of 7.5 to 9.27 millimeters. The smaller rings range from 0.83 to 1.21 millimeters in thickness, with an inner diameter of 6 to 6.5 millimeters. The plate armor on the front is difficult to measure accurately, but measurements taken along the extremities revealed a variable thickness ranging from 1.09 to 1.71 millimeters. Toward the center, however, the plate becomes noticeably thicker. As in many cultures, supplementary body armor often included some form of collar protection to reinforce vulnerable areas of the soldier. In the Islamic world, extended coifs were common, offering face protection and extending to the lower chest to provide an additional layer of defense over areas not covered by plate armor. For our test, we'll be adding a coif dated between the 16th and 17th century to supplement the armor. The original coif was in desperate need of restoration when purchased, but with the help of consultations with master mailsmith Phil Parks, we were able to restore the artifact as closely as possible to its original state. This coif closely matches that of two examples currently on display at the National Museum of Delhi. The rings in this armour are quite fine compared to that of the plate mail. They measure between 0.54 and 1.75 millimeters in thickness, with an inner diameter of 5.7 to 7.36 millimeters. It is also important to note that a heavy cavalryman would likely have been equipped with a round shield, most commonly a dal, to provide significant directional protection. However, this will not be included in our test. The war arrows of the Mughal Empire were diverse in both design and function. Broadly speaking, they can be categorized into 4 distinct groups, though a variety of designs can be found even within these categories. These arrowhead designs include broadheads, armor-penetrating bodkins, siege arrows, and needle-point bodkins. The weight of these arrows varies, but generally Mughal arrows tend to be lighter than their European counterparts, ranging from around 300 grains up to 900 grains. The siege arrow variants are typically the heaviest of arrows, but we can find both light and heavy arrow variants of the other arrow groups as well. The arrowheads we'll be using today include original artifacts that have been restored and mounted on brand new shafts. For today's test, we will be using an Ottoman warbow of a modest 100 pounds in draw weight. The Ottoman warbow is a close relative of the Mughal bows of the period. When tested with a chronograph, Mughal war arrows loosed from this bow can produce up to 92 joules of energy. But the true weapon is the archer himself. It can take years of dedication and training to master these bows, especially the heaviest warbows, which typically start at 80 pounds and can reach incredible draw weights of up to 200 pounds. To ensure accuracy and avoid wasting precious arrows, today's test will be conducted at a distance of 10 yards. This close range is offset by the modest draw weight of the bow being used. Based on the best estimates drawing from primary sources and archaeological evidence, the average draw weight for Mughal warbows was likely around 110 to 120 pounds. And thanks to tests conducted by master warbow archer Joe Gibbs with Todd Cutler, we know that war arrows lose only about 20% of their energy at a range of 50 to 60 meters. With that in mind, today's test will simulate the results of a 120-pound bow hitting the armor at approximately 50 to 60 meters, a more realistic engagement range.
First arrow, 718 grain. It's going to be a needle, so we're going to do the needles first. Oof. That's actually hit the plate and broken the arrow as well in the process. So this is the first needle, absolutely curled. That hit the plate, and we can see what happens to these needle bodkins when they hit plate, which is very consistent with European sources and European armor tests as well. So let's continue. Let's get to the next needle. Okay, next needle is going to be 568 grains. Okay, next arrow is going to be 518 grain needle. So we've had 2 strikes on the plate, completely curling and destroying the arrows. When it doesn't hit the plate though, it is going in. So let's go on to the next arrow types. Okay, the siege arrows. First siege arrow is going to be 926 grains. So I think this is the heaviest arrow I have. That's actually gone through the shoulder blade. 757 grain, a little bit of a lighter siege arrow. Now, there's a bit of a misnomer with siege arrows. They're actually anti-siege arrows. These are actually designed based on the source material to be fired off battlements downwards. That's why they got these really heavy heads, so they can maintain that momentum being fired downwards to impact with even greater force. So technically, even though we're at a short range today, because these are designed to be fired off battlements going down, you know, where you can use a lighter bow to get a higher amount of energy that you would typically need for a heavier bow at a longer range with these type of arrows, or at least that's the theory. On the plate. Shattered the arrow, 100% shattered the arrow. The plate looks like it's holding up really well. The mail, not so well. Last siege arrow, 738 grain, reasonable weight, but a lighter weight siege arrow. That's actually gone. I'm going to leave that one actually. That's actually hit the arm. It's gone through the mail of the arm. So the arm is obviously lighter mail. I'm going to let that stand actually. I'm not going to shoot at the body because we've got one siege arrow in the mail. We've got one needle in the mail as well. We have another siege arrow that's gone through the mail of the arm. So I'm going to let that one stand because that's like a wounding shot to the arm, and we'll see the type of damage and how far that's passed into the target behind the armor. Our very last arrow is going to be the pyramid head, which is, you know, supposed to be an armor penetrator. This arrow is 708 grain. So again, for Mughal arrows, that's pretty decent weight because they tend to be quite lighter, but compared to, you know, European standards, they are very light arrows. Straight through again. We're going to go inspect the armor very soon, but we do see the plate is really great. It holds up really well. It's absolutely destroying the arrows, but the mail though is a fundamental weakness of the armor. Now, there are reasons why they used mail and plate in the Mughal Empire. They preferred a more of a mobile type of warfare, a lot of horse archery, and we have to remember they also had shields were very common in this period as that kind of first layer of defense, even though it's directional. But we can certainly see at this stage the effectiveness of the arrows against this armor, while at the same time we can see the armor working really well where the plate is. So let's go down now and let's inspect the damage, see how deep some of these arrows went, because I can tell you one of them specifically has gone incredibly deep. So let's go see what happened.
For reference, we can see that the mail is uncompromised in the areas where we struck it with the needle, the siege arrow, and the pyramid arrow before the test. I also want to assure the viewers that we are restoring the armor back to its original condition, and that process is being undertaken as this video is being uploaded.
We can see one of the siege arrows, as well as the pyramid, go straight through the mail, through the padded garment underneath, and we can see here through the back of the armor. So it hasn't gone through the plates on the back, but it's pushed them aside and penetrated all the way through the dummy into the target behind. So these two are definitely immobilizing and incapacitating shots through the shoulder. No vital organs, so to speak, but we can see fundamentally the effect of the arrows on the mail and how easy they can pass through the mail. This one over here is the needle. I've marked them all so we can pull them out and we can see the depths. This one, surprisingly, the needle, which is optimized against mail, doesn't seem to have passed as far as the other two, but perhaps that's because the mail down here is a little bit thicker than the mail in the shoulder joints. That's what I'm suspecting, but it definitely has penetrated and it's torn the rings apart as well in the process. Whereas when we hit, then we have another siege arrow here, we can see this has gone through the arm, through 2 layers of mail, and pinned the arm, or at least the mail itself, you know, into the target behind. So that's pierced 2 layers of mail, but again, that's thinner mail as well on the extremities. When we hit the plate though, so bring it in close. When we hit the plate though, this plate has held up amazingly well. So we can see the heavier needle that I used absolutely curled. Even the siege arrow, which is a heavy arrow, and this was the 880 grain arrow, No, this was the 758 grain arrow. We can see it's bending and deforming, breaking the tang, doing some serious damage. And bring it in close. We have a very slight indentation here, very slight. We have also another little indentation over here, and I believe the third arrow was here underneath the cleats or the clips. The plate is heavy, very heavy. You know, this is reminiscent of the, Arrows versus Armour one on Todd's workshop when they were hitting the plate and he was just only marring it. And quite frankly, I'm not surprised because this armor is being used in an age of gunfire as well, or black powder weapons, I should say. So the plate itself has to be very, very robust. But we are definitely seeing the effect of the armor, the arrows, when it does hit the mail, how effective the arrows can be against this type of armor. So when we hit the plate as well, and we've got the bigger indentation, funnily enough, that's also hit the coif because the coif is hanging to where the plate is. So it's obviously burst through the coif. I'm not surprised. The coif is a relatively light mail, or in fact, not just relatively, it's actually quite light. Full stop. It's just a very light type of armor that's probably there as a second layer of defense, not primary, designed to protect the throat and the face from slashes while giving a little bit of extra protection to the chest, not too much. But it has definitely hit the coif, gone through, hit the plate, and the plate has just stood up to the damage and the abuse phenomenally well, which I'm really, really happy with that. So let me pull the arrows out now. Let's see how deep they have gone. But we could see with these two here in the shoulder, absolutely incapacitating shots. Straight through the shoulder, straight through the other end and into the target behind the armor itself. Okay, so the needle has come out, okay, and it's about 90 mils of penetration. What's important about the needle is I want to come in closer, where the shot is. It has absolutely mangled the mail, or it's at least damaged multiple rings as it's being pulled into the target. It's drawing the mail and breaking the rings themselves.
And when reviewing the footage, we can see when the arrow strikes, it actually kicks up and we can see some of those mail rings tearing. And when we inspected the armor after the test, like we can see here, something really interesting revealed itself. The links that are actually attached to the plate themselves are actually butted mail rings. They're not riveted, so they present an area of weakness that can be torn off the plates and create those larger gaping holes. However, by that same token, the butted mail rings may have provided some resistance that while the arrow is penetrating and those rings do expand because they are butted, they're not riveted, they potentially can rob the arrow of some energy, which may also be contributing to the reason why the needle bodkin itself didn't penetrate as far as the other arrows. Now, we saw a little bit of this phenomenon in my lamellar test. When the arrows strike the lames, the actual lacing itself bursts and potentially robs the arrows of some energy, preventing some of the penetration. So we may be seeing some of that with this design. We can also see similar areas of similar types of damage on the armor from before the test, which I mean, it's hard to tell for sure, but may have been battle damage to the original armor from the Siege of Adoni itself.
Okay, and where that is, I think that's probably a little bit left of the heart, but definitely the depth of 90 millimeters is probably far enough to take that to the lungs potentially and cause, I would say maybe not a guaranteed kill shot, but I would say that could be a kill shot. This is the pyramid head, and we can see that penetration. We can see that from the back. I don't need to measure this. What are we looking at? 15 inches of penetration through the target, through the mail, through the padded garment, absolutely taking you out of the fight. Same thing with this siege arrow as well. And this is the heavier siege arrow, 880 grains. Again, no real vital organs up here, but going through the shoulder joint, and that's again a good 15 inches of penetration, maybe a bit more. You're out of the fight. You're not using that arm anymore. And then we have the final siege arrow through the arm. Again, not a fatal blow, but that arm's going to be out of action again. But potentially that arm might have had a shield. But so if you hit the other arm that doesn't have the shield, then that's what it would do to it. But we have to remember that they do have shields. Now, the size of those shields can vary. okay, from buckler size to, you know, more, I think they're called rodellas, the Italian sized shields. So they can be quite big, but again, it's going to be different from soldier to soldier, but that's gone through 2 layers of mail on the arms. Okay, so those are our results. So first and foremost, I hope you really enjoyed this test. And if you did, thank you for getting this far. Now, at the beginning of the presentation, we talked about one of the key factors as to why the commanders of the time, especially this late into the 17th century, may have still relied upon archery as a tool for warfare in an age where really black powder weapons, musketry, arquebuses were really taking over the planet. In fact, the arquebuses were, and the muskets themselves, were really becoming the primary weapon for ranged warfare as early as the early to mid 16th century. And here we have a set of armor, 17th century, late 17th century. The arrows themselves are also late 17th century going into the 18th century. And this really does answer the question of, can archery still be effective? And the question is a little bit mixed. Against the plate, certainly not. Against the mail, incredibly effective. So I think we do answer the question of, you know, the effectiveness of bows and arrows. A weapon system that is, you know, really in its essence quite archaic, and this type of early modern warfare period where this weapon system can still be effective. But that alone doesn't really answer the question as to why did they use bows when they had firearms, and they were using them for centuries at this stage. And I think specifically for the Mughal Empire, we have to remember there are environmental conditions at play here. On the subcontinent of India, 5 out of the 12 months are incredibly humid and very wet. And we have to understand, black powder weapons, specifically matchlock weapons, which were very abundant at this time, they start to become more unreliable in wet weather. So the bow is a perfect weapon system to use alongside firearms to plug the holes in strategic deficiencies that black powder weapons may have during particularly, you know, wet seasons. As I said, 5 out of the 12 months for large parts of India are actually very, very humid, including monsoons. And these bows can be very easily waterproofed. The third reason, though, is also the Mughal Empire did not have the logistic constraints of implementing bows in the same way as the continental mainland European powers. And that's to say that they still had a rich culture of martial use of bows. Okay, so they were able to rely upon a ready supply of men. They were able to use these heavier bows for warfare. So they didn't have the same constraints that a lot of the mainland European powers did. So in order to train a musketeer, it takes typically about 10 to 12 weeks. It's not that hard. However, to train an archer to even draw, say, you know, a 100-pound bow like this one, which is not even an average weight bow, it's probably a little bit under average, typically takes on average about 12 months of training. Now, certainly stronger individuals will be able to achieve that faster, and weaker individuals will be able to, you know, will have to take longer to do that. But we're looking at a difference of, you know, say 12 weeks at max to an average of 12 months. And that is a massive time to be able to recruit, train, and then field troops on the battlefield. And the Mughal Empire did not have that logistical constraint because they still valued archery. And perhaps that's also because of the environmental factors. They knew they still had to keep up with the practice in order to be able to field soldiers during the period to be able to plug those strategic deficiencies of black powder weapons, specifically on the continent of India. But the fact that they kept using the bows gives us perhaps some insight. You know, obviously we've seen the results, gives us some insight into the effectiveness of the bows even this late in the period where black powder weapons have been used around the globe. Now, I want to double down on this point though. This is not to say that bows are the equal to black powder weapons. It's not to say that they are better or they're equals. What it is to say is that they present a unique strategic opportunity in where we can use them alongside black powder weapons to gain some strategical kind of advantage on a battlefield, depending on the environmental factors. And particularly, as I said earlier, because we don't have that kind of logistical constraint with recruiting men, which is probably one of the key or the most key reason why we saw the earlier transition from bows to black powder weapons in Europe, particularly on the mainland. Whereas if we go to England, they were still using bows, you know, as their primary weapon even into the 16th century. So we have the Battle of Flodden, where the bow against the Scots was the primary ranged weapon, and I don't think they had any muskets, although there were cannons in that battle. And there was another battle in the mid 16th century. I think it's the Battle of Pinkie Hill. I might be getting it wrong, and I'll put the correct battle and date on the screen now, where it was again against the Scots. And it was in the mid 16th century, and the bow once again for the English was the primary ranged weapon. Now they did have muskets on the battlefield as well, but it's estimated they had only about 500 muskets on the English side, which is still a significant number, but the primary weapon of the bows themselves numbered in the thousands. So that goes to perhaps the third point of that kind of martial tradition, where when you still have ready available men, you don't need to transition to the black powder weapons, because you're not constrained by that kind of training of fresh recruits, because you have a ready body of men that you can rely upon to field in mass on battlefields. But even the English as well, of course, transitioned to the black powder weapon sooner rather than later, just like most powers did, including the Mughal Empire. So even though they were using bows in the late 17th century and even in the early 18th century, the black powder weapons and muskets were the primary ranged weapon. But I think, you know, we kind of do answer some of those questions today as to why they continue to use these weapons. So I hope you really enjoyed this video. I enjoyed shooting this video. This was perhaps one of my best videos, or one of my best tests that I've done. So again, if you like this type of content, please like and subscribe. And once again, thank you very much for watching.